Some people in history didn't just die, they were executed in ways so brutal. They were meant to terrify entire civilizations, not just to punish, but to send a message that said, this is what happens if you step out of line. From slow public torture to executions designed to last for days. Some of these methods are almost impossible to imagine today. So here are history's most brutal death penalties explained. Jesus Christ. In the first century under Roman rule, crucifixion was a method of execution specifically designed to prolong suffering while serving as a public warning. Jesus, accused of treason and blasphemy, was condemned to death by the Roman governor Pontius Pilate. Despite accounts suggesting doubt surrounding his guilt, the execution proceeded under pressure from religious authorities and the crowd. Forced to carry his own cross through the streets of Jerusalem, he endured physical exhaustion, public humiliation, and repeated mockery. By the time he reached Golgotha, the site of execution, his body had already been weakened. There he was nailed to the cross, through his hands and feet, suspended in a position that made even breathing a struggle. The method itself was one of the most agonizing ever devised. Victims often remained alive for hours or even days, their lungs slowly collapsing under the weight of their own bodies as they struggled to inhale. For Jesus, the suffering was intensified by additional torment, including a crown of thorns pressed onto his head and continuous verbal abuse from those gathered to watch. Crucifixion was not simply a method of death, it was a calculated display of power, designed to instill fear in anyone who witnessed it. What makes this execution especially significant is not only the cruelty involved, but the lasting impact it left behind. The crucifixion became the foundation of Christianity, transforming an instrument of torture into a global symbol of sacrifice, redemption, and faith. Even today, it remains one of the most widely recognized executions in human history, studied across disciplines and remembered across cultures. Joan of Arc. Centuries later, execution once again took on a far more violent and public form. Joan of Arc, the teenage peasant who claimed divine visions and led French forces to key victories during the Hundred Years' War, became a powerful symbol of resistance. Her influence, however, made her a target. Captured by English forces and their allies, she was placed on trial for heresy, witchcraft, and other charges that were largely politically motivated. The outcome was effectively predetermined. On May 30th, 1431, Joan was taken to the marketplace in Rouen and sentenced to be burned at the stake. Bound tightly to a wooden post, she was surrounded by a pile of wood as a crowd gathered to witness the execution. As the fire was lit, flames rose steadily, engulfing her in a slow and agonizing death. Eyewitnesses described her calling out in prayer, even as the smoke and heat intensified. The method itself was designed to maximize suffering while reinforcing authority. Burning at the stake served both as punishment and as a warning, demonstrating the consequences of defying religious or political power. What makes Joan of Arc's execution especially haunting is the injustice behind it. She had risen from obscurity to become a symbol of hope for her people, only to be condemned and destroyed by those in power. Yet her death did not erase her legacy. Instead, it strengthened it, and centuries later, she was recognized as a saint. Guillotine. In 1793, during the height of the French Revolution, King Louis XVI faced an execution that symbolized the collapse of an entire system of power. Once the absolute monarch of France, he was tried for treason and found guilty by revolutionary forces determined to dismantle the old order. The execution took place in a public square before a large and restless crowd. Louis was brought to the guillotine, a device designed to deliver a swift and efficient death. Within seconds, the blade dropped, ending his life with mechanical precision. The guillotine was introduced as a more humane method of execution, intended to reduce prolonged suffering. However, it quickly became associated with mass executions during the Reign of Terror, where thousands met the same fate. What makes this moment especially significant is its symbolism. The execution of a king, demonstrated that no individual, regardless of status, was beyond the reach of revolutionary justice. It marked the definitive break between monarchy and the new political order that followed. Socrates. In 399 BC, the execution of Socrates revealed a very different kind of death, one that relied less on physical brutality and more on controlled inevitability. The Athenian philosopher was charged with corrupting the youth and failing to acknowledge the gods recognized by the Marsuchitas state. While the accusations reflected growing discomfort with his teachings, the trial ultimately led to a death sentence. Socrates was ordered to drink a cup of hemlock, a poisonous mixture used by the state for executions. Surrounded by his followers, he reportedly remained calm, continuing to speak about philosophy and the nature of the soul even as the poison began to take effect. Paralysis gradually spread through his body, starting from his legs and moving upward until it reached his chest. The method itself was quiet and deliberate. Victims remained conscious as their bodily functions slowly shut down, fully aware of their approaching death. Unlike many executions, there was no spectacle, no crowd-driven violence, only a steady and unavoidable progression toward the end. What makes this execution especially haunting is not the brutality of the method, but the meaning behind it. Socrates' death highlighted the tension between free thought and authority, demonstrating how societies can turn against those who challenge established beliefs. Rather than silencing his ideas, the execution ensured their survival, shaping philosophy for generations. Hanging. In 2006, the execution of Saddam Hussein brought global attention to the modern application of capital punishment. After decades of ruling Iraq through fear, repression, and widespread violence, Saddam was captured by U.S. forces in 2003 and later tried for crimes against humanity, including the killing of 148 Shia villagers in Dujail. Following a widely publicized trial, he was sentenced to death by hanging. On December 30, 2006, Saddam was led to the gallows in Baghdad. The execution itself was carried out quickly with a noose placed around his neck before the trapdoor was released, ending his life within seconds. However, what followed transformed the event into something far more controversial. Leaked cell phone footage of the execution spread rapidly across the world, revealing taunts from guards in a chaotic atmosphere that contrasted sharply with the formality typically associated with state executions. The method itself was intended to be swift and decisive, but the surrounding circumstances exposed deep political and sectarian tensions. Rather than presenting a controlled image of justice, the execution appeared to many as a moment of disorder and unresolved conflict. What makes this execution especially significant is the way it was witnessed. Unlike historical executions observed only by those present, Saddam Hussein's death unfolded in the digital age, where images and reactions spread instantly across the globe. It became not just an execution, but a global event that highlighted the complexities of justice, power, and perception in the modern world. Firing squad. In the early hours of July 17, 1918, the Romanov family met one of the most brutal ends in modern history. Tsar Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, and their 5 children had been held captive following the Russian Revolution, their power stripped away as the old imperial system collapsed. For months, they lived under constant surveillance, uncertain of their fate, as political tensions escalated. On that night, Bolshevik guards entered their quarters and instructed the family to gather their belongings, claiming they were being moved for safety. They were led into a basement room in the Ipatiev house, along with a small group of loyal servants. Moments later, without warning, the guards opened fire. The confined space quickly descended into chaos. Bullets ricocheted off the walls and even off hidden jewels sewn into the daughter's clothing, prolonging the violence. The initial volley failed to kill everyone instantly, forcing the guards to use bayonets and additional gunshots to complete the execution. Within minutes, the entire family and their attendants were dead, their bodies later disposed of in secret to conceal the crime. The method itself was swift but disorderly. lacking the controlled precision seen in other executions. Instead, it reflected the instability and urgency of a revolution determined to eliminate any possibility of a royal return. What makes this execution especially haunting is not only its brutality, but its historical significance. The killing of the Romanov family marked the definitive end of Imperial Russia and the beginning of a new political era. It was not just the execution of individuals, but the destruction of an entire dynasty that had ruled for centuries. Impalement. In the 15th century, Vlad III of Wallachia became one of the most feared rulers in Eastern Europe, largely due to the method of execution he made infamous. Known for defending his territory against the Ottoman Empire, Vlad used impalement as both punishment and psychological warfare. Victims were forced onto long, wooden stakes, which were driven through the body and planted upright in the ground. The process was designed to avoid immediate death, allowing the victim to remain alive for hours or even days. These executions were often carried out in large numbers, with fields of impaled bodies displayed along roads or near cities. The method itself was slow and deliberate, turning death into a prolonged experience. It also served a broader purpose, creating a visible warning to enemies and subjects alike. What makes this practice especially disturbing is its scale and intent. Impalement was not used sparingly, but as a systematic tool of control. The visibility of the punishment ensured that its impact extended far beyond the individual, reinforcing authority through fear. Hanged, drawn, quartered. In 1606, Guy Fawkes, one of the central figures behind the failed gunpowder plot, was subjected to one of the most brutal forms of execution in English history. The plot itself aimed to assassinate King James I and destroy the Houses of Parliament, an act that was seen as an extreme betrayal of the state. After his capture, Fawkes was imprisoned and subjected to interrogation and torture until he revealed the details of the conspiracy. He was ultimately convicted of treason, a crime that carried one of the harshest punishments imaginable. The sentence was to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. This process began with the condemned being dragged to the execution site, often on a wooden sled. He would then be hanged until near death, but not long enough to die completely. What followed was far more gruesome, involving the removal of internal organs and the division of the body into parts, which were later displayed publicly as a warning. The method itself was deliberately prolonged and highly symbolic. Each stage of the execution was designed to reflect the severity of the crime, turning the punishment into a spectacle of suffering and a message to anyone who might consider similar acts. What makes Guy Fawkes' execution especially chilling is the calculated nature of the process. It was not intended to be swift or merciful. Instead, it served as a demonstration of absolute authority, reinforcing the consequences of treason in the most extreme way possible. Medieval execution. Around the same period, William Wallace, the Scottish leader who resisted English rule, faced a similarly brutal fate. Captured in 1305 after years of leading a rebellion against King Edward I, Wallace was transported to London to stand trial for treason. The charges were politically driven, as Wallace had never sworn allegiance to the English crown, yet the outcome was never in doubt. He was sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, a punishment reserved for those considered enemies of the state. The execution began with Wallace being dragged through the streets to the site, a public display intended to humiliate and strip him of dignity. He was then hanged, but cut down before death, ensuring the suffering would continue. What followed was a sequence of physical mutilation carried out in front of a crowd. The process was deliberate and structured, designed to extend the punishment beyond a single moment. His body was ultimately divided, with parts displayed in different locations as a warning to others. The method itself was not only about execution, but about control. It transformed punishment into a public statement, reinforcing authority through fear. What makes Wallace's execution especially significant is its lasting impact. Rather than its suppressing resistance, his death strengthened his legacy, turning him into a symbol of defiance and national identity in Scottish history. Electric chair. In 1890, the execution of William Kemmler marked the beginning of a new era in capital punishment. Convicted of murder in the United States, he became the first person to be executed using the electric chair, a method introduced as a more humane alternative to hanging. The process was intended to be quick and efficient. Kemmler was strapped into the chair, and an electrical current was passed through his body. However, the initial attempt failed to cause immediate death. Witnesses reported that the current was stopped too soon, leaving him still alive. A second, more powerful surge of electricity was then applied, ultimately ending his life. The execution, rather than demonstrating a cleaner method, raised serious concerns about the reliability and ethics of this new technology. The method itself reflected an attempt to modernize execution, replacing visibly violent methods with something that appeared more controlled. In practice, however, it revealed the difficulty of making death both efficient and humane. What makes this execution especially haunting is the contradiction it exposed. A system designed to reduce suffering instead introduced new forms of uncertainty, showing that technological advancement does not necessarily eliminate the fundamental brutality of capital punishment. Gas chamber. In the decades that followed, the gas chamber emerged as another attempt to refine execution methods in the United States. Introduced in the early 20th century, it was presented as a more clinical and less visibly violent alternative. The process involved placing the condemned individual in a sealed chamber, where a chemical reaction would release a toxic gas. Once inhaled, the gas interfered with the body's ability to use oxygen, leading to death. Although intended to be efficient, many executions did not proceed as planned. Witnesses often described prolonged and distressing scenes, with individuals showing visible signs of struggle before losing consciousness. The method itself aimed to create a controlled environment, removing the physical spectacle associated with earlier forms of execution. However, the reality often contradicted this intention, raising concerns about the actual experience of those subjected to it. What makes the gas chamber especially unsettling is the gap between perception and reality. It was introduced as a more humane solution, yet the experiences reported during its use suggested that the suffering it caused was far from minimal. Over time, this contributed to its decline and eventual replacement by other methods. Breaking wheel. In medieval Europe, another method of execution reflected a similar approach to prolonged suffering. The breaking wheel, sometimes referred to as the Catherine wheel, was used to punish serious crimes through a highly physical and extended process. Victims were tied to a large wooden wheel, after which executioners used heavy implements to strike and break the bones of the body, often in a specific sequence. In some cases, the individual would remain alive after the initial blows, left exposed for hours or even days before death occurred. The method itself emphasized duration over immediacy. Rather than ending life quickly, it prolonged the experience, making the execution visible and memorable. What makes the breaking wheel especially haunting is the way it transformed punishment into endurance. It was not simply about death, but about sustaining suffering in a controlled and deliberate manner, ensuring that the execution left a lasting impression on those who witnessed it. Stoning. Stoning represents another form of execution that relied not on a single executioner, but on collective participation. Used in various societies throughout history, it involved a group of individuals throwing stones at the condemned person until death occurred. The process could be prolonged, depending on the size of the crowd and the force of the blows. Unlike other methods, responsibility was distributed among many participants, creating a shared act rather than an individual one. The method itself emphasized communal involvement, turning execution into a collective enforcement of law or belief. It removed the distance between the act and the observers, making them direct participants in the outcome. What makes stoning particularly unsettling is this shared responsibility. It reflects a form of punishment where the boundary between authority and crowd becomes blurred, demonstrating how groups can carry out acts of violence under the justification of justice or tradition. Scaphism. One of the most extreme methods ever recorded comes from ancient Persia, known as Scaphism. Unlike many other forms of execution, this method was designed to prolong suffering over an extended period, often lasting several days. The victim was placed between two hollowed wooden structures or boats, with only the head, hands, and feet exposed. They were force-fed and covered with substances that attracted insects while being left in the open. Over time, exposure, infection, and continuous infestation would gradually lead to death. The method itself relied on duration rather than immediate harm. It turned the natural environment into part of the execution, allowing time and biological processes to take their course. What makes Scaphism especially horrifying is the extent of its design. It was not intended to end life quickly, but to extend suffering as much as possible. The slow progression made it one of the most prolonged and extreme forms of execution ever documented. These death penalties, though separated by time, culture, and purpose, reveal a consistent pattern in human history. Execution was rarely just about ending a life. It was used to display power, enforce control, and shape the behavior of others. From public spectacles to controlled procedures, each method reflected the values and fears of the society that carried it out. Some became symbols of belief, others warnings, and many remain subjects of debate even today. Lingchi. In imperial China, one of the most feared forms of execution was known as Lingchi, often translated as death by 1,000 cuts. This method was reserved for the most serious crimes, including treason, and was intended not only to end a life, but to strip the individual of dignity both physically and symbolically. The process involved a series of controlled cuts made over a period of time. Executioners were trained to carry out the procedure in a deliberate manner, ensuring that the victim remained alive for as long as possible. Unlike other methods that relied on a single act, Lingchi extended the experience, turning it into a gradual progression toward death. The method itself reflected a combination of punishment and ritual. It was not only about physical suffering, but also about public disgrace, as the body was systematically reduced in front of witnesses. What makes Lingchi especially disturbing is its precision. The execution required control and intent, transforming it into a calculated process rather than a chaotic act of violence. Its use reinforced the authority of the state while demonstrating the consequences of severe crimes in a highly visible way. After hearing all of these, which one do you think was the most brutal? And more importantly, which one do you think crossed the line the most? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more deep dives into the darkest parts of history, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because in the next video, we're diving into another side of history that most people think they understand, but really don't.